Yeah.
So what is that?
So they're what we call our brine concentrators that are part of our water treatment plant. So that's where all the brine obviously is stored and pumped through. There's 3 of those, that's just a smaller picture. And then the water goes through a different section of the actual treatment plant.
So what is the brine? What is that?
Salt. So the salt that comes out with the water, this stage, there's no way, because when we're pulling the gas and water up, there's no way at this stage that we cannot bring the water as well. So part of the water there is a certain element of brine, and it's pumped through those brine concentrators, and then at this stage, it's stored in what we call brine concentrated ponds. It's still going through.
And what happens with that?
Well, that's at the moment still in discussion. So obviously, state government and national government still working with the industries to work out what they'll do. So our water that comes, so all the water, so the brine is put in a separate holding pond, and all the water that we pull out has to be reused. So we have beneficial use schemes. So from our plant at Kenya, which is heading out to Chinchilla about 30 minutes away, we run a pipeline from that facility through to the Chinchilla weir. On that pipeline, farmers can take a certain allocation of water, and then the rest is pumped into the Chinchilla weir. Same in the north, just the Glebe weir up in.
So what with the brine, what happens to that?
So that's just in negotiations at the moment.
So they're not...
No, so no decision has been made at this stage as to the future of brine for all the industry.
So they can't use it yet?
Well, they've just got it in the storage holding ponds, but there was different elements. I was looking at, there was a few like building a pipeline from here and pumping the actual salt back into the ocean. There was a lot of different avenues, but no decision has been made.
QGC make their treated CSG waste available to some water who release it via a diffuser into the Condamine River.
So about in 2012, I think it was when the Kenya reverse osmosis plant came into operation. So there's a 25-kilometre pipeline that goes from the Kenya plant, travelling with its end destination being the weir. Along that pipeline, farmers were offered that reverse osmosis water as a way to drought-proof their properties, and some spent a lot of money, more than $1 million, putting in the associated infrastructure. And they buy that water at a set price per kilolitre, and they were supposed to buy a set amount of that water. If they chose not to, if there'd been plenty of rain, for instance, they didn't need the water, they would be penalised at something like 10 times what they would buy the water for to not take it. So I don't know how beneficial that is. So any water that was not taken up by the farmers progressed down and is dumped into our weir. Now at the time I had some correspondence with Marion Lloyd-Smith from the National Toxics Network.
Which brings me on to myth number 3, that the CSG can provide clean water for farmers. That is not possible. Again, if you go to industry's own documents, if you go to the National Water Commission, if you go to the documents of the reverse osmosis industry, their technologists, they will tell you that they cannot remove many of the chemicals that are used by CSG. They're what called small or low molecular weight chemicals, and they just won't easily be removed using reverse osmosis. And so some of those chemicals I mentioned earlier, naphthalene, nonylphenol, they're the type of chemicals that reverse osmosis cannot treat. Again, looking at our testing at the Pilliga Forest, we did some testing on treated CSG water. This is water that had gone through the reverse osmosis. And we found high levels of methane, ammonia, boron and bromine. This was certainly not clean water that was being released into the creek. And also, if it was clean, then why would the Queensland release permits permit a company to pump out 20 megalitres per day for 18 months, water that is contaminated, remember this is treated water, contaminated with 80 chemicals plus radionuclides? There's no requirement for them to do any prior assessment of that cumulative load, and that's a real worry, of course, because these are chemicals that are persistent, they're bioaccumulative, that is, they build up in our bodies, and they are toxic.
At this stage, that water's going in. We don't know how much is going in. We're not allowed to know. I've tried to find out. Sunwater won't release those details. So I find that very worrying, that we can't find out how much water goes in there. We don't hear it spruiked about, like when they first rolled it out, it was sold to the community as this wonderful new beneficial water scheme and it would drought-proof the town, which is insane because then they contradicted that straight away and say, but we must release as much as is being putting in. So in other words, they're diluting